When we left off, we theological basis towards attitude towards Jews and how it was implemented politically, how it was upset by the Crusades. But let's talk a little bit about the popular image of Jews, or the image of Jews in the popular Christian imagination. Most Christians were not St. Augustine or a mendicant friar. Most Christians, where did this person get an education? Because 95% of Christians did not go to school. The sermon they would hear in church, that's what they knew. They would learn from their parents, from their families, good. They would also, remember, mendicant friars and other Christian clergy weren't only scholars, they were preachers. They would stand in the public square and preach a message. And for many Christians, this is what they had in lieu of an education. In particular, there was this Christian ritual known as the Passion Play, or the Passion Play series, where from time to time in different places, Christians or a community would act out the whole cycle of the life and death of Christ, including the part where Christians presented Jews as being responsible for the crucifixion. And that's where Christians, the ordinary Christians, began to imbibe certain ideas. So they learned about deicide. They learned, first and foremost, that Jews were guilty of murdering Christ and had been condemned by God and Christ to suffer for all eternity. That was lesson number one. Lesson number two in this popular Christian imagination was the only way to explain why Jews did that is because Jews are the servants of Satan. Jews were seen as the embodiment of evil. Now, once you see Jews as the servants of Satan, a whole series of beliefs follow naturally. You've seen depictions of Satan, of the devil. I mean, they're all over the place. You picture his appearance. He's got the little beard here, the little goatee. So there was the stereotype that that's why Jews had the beard. There was a tail. There were people who believed that Jews had a tail. Their preferred animal was a goat for a variety of reasons. And there was this stereotype about Jews that they smelled like a goat. Now, in Latin, in the Middle Ages, it was called foetor judaicus, the Jewish stench. One maybe most familiar with you is that, like the devil, Jews have horns. Let me tell you that as a stereotype, this one goes all the way into the 20th century. I remember when I was a kid, I met people for whom I was the first Jew they ever met, and they were looking to see. There are no horns here, by the way, I assure you. I'm hornless. Now, the stereotype about the horn didn't only derive from the connection to Satan. It was actually reinforced a Christian mistranslation of a verse in the Bible. In the story, Moses goes up to Mount Sinai to get the Ten Commandments, and when he's coming down from Mount Sinai, he's describing as having, in Hebrew it says, karan or panav. Now, the word karan in Hebrew is the verb form of the word keren. It can mean rays of light. And that's what it meant. When he was coming down from Sinai, Moses had rays of light coming out of his head. After all, he'd just been talking to God for 40 days. But here's the thing. The Hebrew word keren doesn't only translate as rays, it also translates as horns. And when St. Jerome in the Vulgate, one of the first Latin translations of the Bible, translated this verse, he didn't write that Moses had rays of light coming out of his head. He wrote that Moses had horns coming out of his head. That was in the 4th century CE. And from that point on, there was this notion that Jews had horns. And as Christians associated Jews with Satan who had horns, that together with this verse fortified that stereotype. Well, it is a mistranslation. And Michelangelo, if you ever see Michelangelo's Moses, he sculpted Moses with horns coming out of his head. Okay? So the horns is one prominent one. One was called desecration of the host. And this was an accusation that said that Jews were accused of sneaking into the church at night and stabbing the communion wafers, literally with a knife, and defiling the wine. The communion wafer is the body of Christ, and the wine is the blood of Christ. And for Catholics, these weren't symbolic representations of the flesh and blood in Christ. These were the actual flesh and blood of Christ, are reenacting the crucifixion again and again. That's a pretty serious accusation. really resonated if you start from the premise that Jews are the servants of the devil. Who else would want Jews to be defiling the most sacred person in the world? The devil, the embodiment of evil. The embodiment of evil, Satan, his servants, attacking the embodiment of good. And the most impactful accusation against Jews was the notion of the blood libel. The blood libel was an accusation, in a nutshell, where Jews were accused of murdering a Christian child and using the blood of that child for sacramental purposes. Children's blood is the purest Christian blood there is. Who would want to defile it more than Satan or one of his servants? First documented blood libel accusation was in the 12th century, 1144. So historians, why specifically in the 12th century did this accusation actually begin to have some traction? This is not only a debate among historians, it's a heated debate for about 20 years now. You remember when we talked about Jewish responses to the Crusades? Even beyond martyrdom, killed their own children to save their children from forced conversion. So the argument is that in addition to all of these Christian theological notions of Satan and the Jews, what gave the blood libel additional traction here about Jews who had killed their own children, and it wasn't a very widespread phenomenon. In fact, it was very limited. But the stories, the rumors, they spread, and Christians heard stories about Jews being willing to kill their own children. And from there they said, well, if Jews are willing to kill their own children, of course they'd be willing to kill a Christian child. Now, like I said, that's a matter of historical debate. That might have been a factor. We know for sure the connection to Satan was not only a factor, but the predominant factor. That other little thing about the Crusades may have been, let's call it an aggravating factor as well. Now, blood libels, you find examples every generation all over Europe. Wherever Jews were in the Christian world, at some point or another there was a blood libel. So at this point, we've seen these Christian accusations against Jews and the attack on the Talmud and disputations, animosity. It was sporadic. I don't want to diminish its impact. It was difficult. If there was a blood libel accusation, that would inevitably lead to a riot and maybe Jews being killed or even a Jewish community being destroyed. So I don't want to minimize it, but it wasn't like every day Jews were dealing with. A lot of this was stuff that Christians would learn in church or hear, but there was this day-to-day life where Christians and Jews managed to coexist comfortably together for a very long time. Jewish responses were not desperate responses. They couldn't publicly condemn any of this. Jews were second-class citizens with limited rights, very vulnerable position. It could be stirred up if the situation called for it. Especially Jews who lived after the First Crusade were always a little bit careful. We don't want to incite anything. Low-profile Jewish responses. In each case, the Nitzachon Vitus and Toldot Yeshu, this is each the name of a text, of a book, that Jews wrote in Hebrew, quietly circulated it. Now let me tell you about each one. I'll tell you about Toldot Yeshu first. Sefer Toldot Yeshu in Hebrew means the book of the history of Jesus, written from let's call it a critical Jewish perspective. It's kind of a retelling, and circulated very quietly, because it basically paints Jesus as a con man. According to Toldot Yeshu, it was believed that went into the Holy of Holies, central part of the temple in Jerusalem. You could learn the true pronunciation of the name of God. That's called the Tetragrammaton, the unpronounceable name of God. If you could learn the proper pronunciation of this Hebrew word for God, which to this day nobody really knows, but you could unlock magical powers. The problem is, outside the Holy of Holies, there were these two statues of fiery angels. And they were so terrifying that if you learned the secret name of God, when you walked out, it would be purged. This is what Jesus did. He brought with him a parchment and a pen and a little knife, some needle and thread. He went into the Holy of Holies. He learned the name of God, the secret name. He wrote it on the parchment. He made a little incision in his arm. He put the parchment in his arm, and he sewed his arm up. So when he walked out of the Holy of Holies, his memory was wiped clean. Sometime later, it's a very Jason Bourne sort of moment. Sometime later he goes, what is this thing in my arm? It's the name of God, and I'm outside the Holy of Holies. Magical powers. Walk on water, bring people to life. Water into what? That according to the Toldot Yeshu, is how Jesus had this sort of supernatural ability. Now that's not a very friendly portrayal of Jesus, and it's not even the worst part. This was designed not so much to criticize Jesus, but to fortify Jews who were facing missionary pressure in their belief that Jesus was not the actual Messiah. That's what Christians believe, but not Jews. Nitzachon Vitzus means the book of the ancient argument, the ancient debate. Now, this book has two parts. The first part of the book is, the author of this book is anonymous. We don't know who it was. It was written about 1,000 years ago. Compiled every Christian interpretation of passages from the Hebrew Bible, we would call Christological interpretations, and one by one, he refuted them. Showed why every Christian reading of the Hebrew Bible is wrong, one by one. That's part one. Part two, he went through the Christian Bible and pointed out all the flaws in the story. This was a tool for Jews to use in a Jewish-Christian debate. Okay, I'll give you an example. The Gospel of Matthew begins by saying first that Jesus was born of a virgin birth, son of the Virgin Mary, but then it traces his genealogy through Joseph back to David to show that he's the Messiah. And in this book it said, wait. If it's a virgin birth, he has no connection to Joseph. So which is it? Virgin birth or connection to David? It's a pretty interesting point. That's an example from part two. Here's an example from part one. There's a verse in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 7:14. The word he uses is Alma. Alma is a word for a young girl. And Alma will give birth to a son, and this son will be called Emmanuel. He will be the Messiah. But the problem is, as the Nitzachon points out, is that they mistranslated the Hebrew word Alma as virgin. So in the Christian reading of this verse, it says, a virgin girl will give birth, and that child will be Jesus. But there's a different Hebrew word for virgin. The Hebrew word for virgin is Betulah. Alma simply means young girl. Now, how differently does that verse read if it says, a virgin will give birth? That's like miraculous. A young girl will give birth, well, that's, maybe problematic in certain ways or whatever, scandalous, but there's nothing miraculous about it. That's an example of pointing out problematic Christian interpretation. What do we have? By the end of the 13th century, we have a more antagonistic and aggressive church. Remember the Fourth Lateran Council? We have the Mendicant friars with their attack. We have these popular images of Jews. But balancing that, we also have Jews who have a certain economic utility and a political utility, and we have Christian sovereigns wanting to keep Jews around. So Jews and Jewish communities, they are balancing, or they are basically existing a balance of theological view, which tends to work against them, but a political and an economic view, which tends to support them. If the stability of the Jewish community rested on economic situation, if they couldn't pay the taxes anymore, even Rutger of Speyer had said, I'm giving you all these privileges on the assumption that you can pay me a tax. Jewish communities that couldn't meet their tax obligation were in trouble. The balance began to shift. And this is what begins to happen beginning in the 1300s and the 1400s. The Jewish community of England. Okay? It was a pretty stable Jewish community. In the year 1190, there was a riot against the Jews of York. York, England was one of the largest Jewish communities. And basically the Jewish community of York was destroyed. They became economically less useful during the course of the 1200s of the 13th century, placing more and more, being more antagonistic. In the year 1290, the Jews were expelled from England. But we can see that expulsion as the combination of a more aggressive Christian theology against Jews and declining economic utility of Jews. In France, during the 1300s, during the 14th century, the Jews of France began to decline economically. Now, in France, there wasn't one date of expelling the Jews. It took the French kings 3 times, 1306, 1332, 1394. But the story there is declining economic utility, and the moment that really tipped it was in the year 1348. Plague, known as the bubonic plague, or the Black Death. From Central Asia, a third of the population of Europe is wiped out. It goes from community to community. Now remember, you have a lot of Christians who, something bad happens, their first instinct is to say, not just that Jews are responsible, but to ask the question, how are Jews responsible? Obviously, this is the work of Satan, and since Jews are their servants, the reason the plague was spreading is that Jews were poisoning the wells of Christians. What made the rumor even more believable than the usual Satan stuff, fewer Jews were dying from this plague than Christians. Many Jews did die, but percentage-wise it was lower. Now, historically, we know there were reasons for this. They lived in a separate Jewish quarter. They were isolated from the Christian population. They usually had their own well, their own source of water. But also, an important part of Judaism was ritual purity and cleanliness. And Jewish men were required to immerse for a variety of reasons. But the point is that your typical Christian peasant in Europe probably bathed once a year. Jews bathed far more. They were more hygienic. I know. But those historical factors are irrelevant to the fact that Christians believed that Jews were responsible, which led to riots, which led to impoverishment of Jewish communities all over Europe. By the end of the 1300s, all Jews in Europe, except for Spain, had been expelled. There were virtually no Jews in everything west of the Rhine. The Holy Roman Empire is an interesting story because there was never a wholesale expulsion of Jews from the Holy Roman Empire because the emperor didn't have that kind of authority. The Holy Roman Empire was a federation of like 300 individual states. Some were a little bigger, some were a single city, and each one of those states had the right to dictate their own policy. There were some states in the Holy Roman Empire where Jews were expelled. And if you were expelled from one of the states of the Holy Roman Empire, following this pattern, you would just go to the neighboring state. From the year 1400 on, you have this recurring sequence of events where Jews would be expelled from one state or one principality or one dukedom or whatever and go to the next one. And a few years later, they might be expelled from there and they would go. They're moving all over. If we had fast action aerial photography, you could see Jews just sort of moving all over the Holy Roman Empire. From this, what came to be known as the wandering Jews. Spain, in some sense, was a different story. Spain was the only part of Europe that for an extended period of time was under Muslim rule. It wasn't called Spain, it was called Al-Andalus. Important part of the Muslim world from the year 711 until 1050. Jews lived in Muslim Spain, and Jews in Muslim Spain thrived in Muslim Spain. Remember, we noted that in the Muslim world, the basis for antagonism, for Christian demonization of Jews didn't exist. The most powerful and prolific Jewish scholars and writing and poetry and communal life developed in Muslims. From about 1050, for the next several centuries, Spain was reconquered by Christians. The Jews who lived in Muslim Spain found themselves living in Christian Spain. The Christians called this the Reconquista. Now I say reconquest. Before Spain was Muslim, it was Visigothic, which was Christian. The Muslims conquered Spain in 711 from Visigothic Christians. They conquered all of it, but one little corner right there, in the year 711, this remained Christians. The king was Alfonso I. The Christians started fighting back to reconquer it immediately, but they made no headway for 300 years. But in the Christian mind, the reconquest of Spain had begun in 711. It was part of this long-standing mission. The Reconquista was basically the version of the Crusades that took place on the Iberian Peninsula in Spain. Instead of Christians seeing Jews as these surrogate infidels to attack, Christians saw Jews as necessary allies against Muslims. Spain was on the frontier of the Christian world. As long as the Reconquista was continuing, Jews in Christian Spain did better. They had a better situation than anywhere else in the world of Christendom. By the way, if you remember last time, the Disputation of Barcelona, remember we said that was the closest Jews came not to losing a disputation? One of the reasons for that is because the situation of Jews in Christian Spain, actually compared to the rest of Christian Europe, it was exceptional. As the Reconquista began to wind down and Christians in Spain no longer needed Jews, the less they were inclined to give Jews favorable treatment. By the year 1250, the Reconquista was mostly over. The Christian armies had conquered all of Spain, but a little part at the bottom that's called Granada. Granada was very difficult to conquer, and Granada was not conquered by Christian forces until 1492. So in the 1200s, the situation is still pretty good, but the balance is shifting. the Jews of Christian Spain kind of revert to that status quo situation elsewhere. It becomes more of a straight balance between the economic and the theological, same as elsewhere. But like I said, it took a lot longer for that balance in Spain to swing against the best interests. Jews have been expelled from the rest of Western Europe. There are local expulsions in the Holy Roman Empire, but in Spain until 1391, still a good place. Still a good place to live. There was no country called Spain in 1391. Spain was made up of a number of different kingdoms, the two most significant of which were Aragon and Castile. Came Spain in 1470 when Ferdinand of Castile married Isabel of Aragon. Their kingdoms united. In the year 1391, there was a series of anti-Jewish riots, spurred by very enthusiastic Christian missionaries who were saying things like, Jews are flourishing too much, the usual stuff. There was no specific event that precipitated it. It came as a bit of a shock, because remember, by 1391, Jews had lived pretty well in Spain for a long time, since the 8th century. And Jews assumed that the difficulty that Jews had faced elsewhere in the Christian world, it's not going to happen in Spain. But the riots broke out. Jewish community after Jewish community was attacked. It was devastating. So first, the devastation was economic. But here's the weird thing that happened. Typically, when Jews faced this kind of persecution, they would hide from it, they would escape, they would flee. There had never been an instance where there was widespread conversion. You know, there were conversions during the Crusades, but not very many. But in Spain, during the years following 1391, some estimate that a third of Jews in Spain became Christian to escape the violence. Like as many as 60,000 Jews. Which, the term that eventually was applied to these Jews, conversos, Spanish or Latin, simply means a convert, or any Christian whose family was not Christian before 1391. Conversos were seen as different than Christians. Religiously, conversos and Christians were indistinguishable. They were ranking members of the church in Spain who were conversos. But the church in Spain and the mendicants in Spain, they were getting increasingly concerned about the sincerity of these conversions. They began to suspect that Jews who converted to Christianity only in the face of persecution, of the riots of 1391, or thereafter, to escape violence. They were practical Christians, openly or ostensibly Christian on the outside, were secretly Jewish on the inside. And the term they used to describe a converso who was Jewish in secret, they called them Marranos. Marrano is a medieval Spanish word for pig. It's really derogatory. Instead of using this very negative term, we refer to these Jews, we call them crypto-Jews or secret Jews. Christian belief needed to be shored up, needed to be fortified in Spain. The King of Aragon in 1412, he convened another disputation, the Disputation of Tortosa. This was a disaster for Jews in Spain. Barcelona, the disputation only lasted a couple of weeks. This one went on for 2 years. And remember, these were very public events that went on forever. As a result, the rate of Jews becoming conversos accelerated. So most of the 60,000 Jews who became conversos converted after the Disputation of Tortosa. It was designed to solve the problem of insincerity, but inadvertently wound up aggravating it because there are now more conversos. In Toledo in 1448, they created special restrictions for conversos. Conversos were defined legally and politically in terms of status as being different from Christians. And some of the same restrictions that Jews in Spain had, restrictions on occupation, restrictions on residence, restrictions on dress, were now applied to conversos as well. These restrictions were called limpieza de sangre, which means purity of blood laws. It could also mean cleansing of blood, but real Christians have pure Christian blood. If you only became Christian after 1391, no matter how sincere religiously you actually were, you're tainted. This is a distinction made on faith on bloodline. can't exactly call it racial laws or racial thinking or profiling. They call it something that's proto-racial. It looks, the mentality is very racial in nature. It's also saying that these Jews who became Christians were not escaping some of the disabilities that were aimed at Jews. They weren't considered Christians. By the end of the 15th century, these laws, the disputation, nothing was solving this converso problem, and the mind of the church, incidents of crypto-Judaism, well, they kept finding them. Especially in 1470, the Catholic Church set up a new organization in Spain called the Spanish Inquisition. The Papal Inquisition had been set up in the 1220s to deal with the problem of Christian heresy. But the Spanish Inquisition was set up in Spain to deal with converso heresy. And you were suspected in any way of doing something secretly Jewish, you were arrested, you were brought before the Inquisition, and, well, you weren't just interrogated. What they would do is they would torture you until you confessed, and then they would kill you. Christians needed to confess their sins before they died. So the Inquisition believed that if there was a converso heretic and died a heretic, they go to hell forever. But we can extract a confession. Maybe they'll go to purgatory or heaven, or it'll be better. That was their rationalization. I mean, to be fair, there were conversos who were practicing some aspect of Judaism in secret. You had to be very careful. So secret Jews would teach their children the Hebrew Bible. Occasionally they would do things like on Friday afternoon when the Sabbath was about to begin for Jews, turn around all the crucifix. Little things like that. Mostly for conversos or for secret Jews. Being Jewish was a belief in your heart. Which brings us to 1492. Despite the Inquisition and all their efforts, the converso problem just wouldn't go away. And in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella concluded, really they were under the influence of the leader of the Inquisition, he said, the only way to solve this converso problem is to get rid of the Jews. As long as there are actual Jews here, conversos are going to be backsliding. And that was the impetus behind the expulsion of Jews from Spain. It didn't actually happen. The converso problem continued in Spain for centuries. I'll give you one example. In 1720, more than 200 years after Jews were expelled, found a whole congregation of 25 crypto-Jewish families in Madrid. So we might say this policy of remove the Jews will solve the problem of crypto-Judaism failed miserably. But it really did in Spain, and really, I mean, it's no coincidence that this is the point in the history of Spain where Spain begins to decline. And not specifically because Jews were expelled. The religious intoleration of the king and the Inquisition, it just constrained all aspects of Spanish society. The expulsion of Jews from Spain coincided with the conquest of Granada and the expulsion of Muslims from Spain. Those two things go hand in hand. It isn't just getting rid of the Jews. It was making Spain a pure, homogeneous Christian state. In fact, Muslims in 15th century Spain were facing some of the same kind of pressure, especially Muslims who in Spain who converted to Christianity to avoid some of that pressure and discrimination. And there is the phenomenon of Muslims who converted but were secretly Muslim or were suspected of secretly Muslim. They came to be known as Moriscos. The Moriscos were the Muslim equivalent of the conversos. So Spain, the expulsion of Jews is trying to make Spain homogeneously Christian. It coincides with the end of the Reconquista and the expulsion of Muslims as well. Everything we've said to this point about Christian Europe, and Christian Europe was more or less homogeneous, it was Catholic, it was the church, and the status of Jews in Christian Europe had more or less stabilized. There were downsides, there were expulsions, but there were still Jews in various places. Western Europe was basically empty, but in the Holy Roman Empire, Jews could continue to live, and there were Jewish communities that were there for a very long time. And even if there were temporary expulsions, they would come back. Same thing in Italy, by the way. The next major change took place during the Reformation. It was really led by one man, Martin Luther, who challenged the primacy of the church. Martin Luther himself was a Catholic priest, in one of the German states, who he began as a priest and then as a monk. He began to see what he felt that the church was increasingly corrupt. And so, Longs began to openly criticize the church for vices like one was simony, where you would sell Christian offices to the highest bidder instead of to the most pious. He felt the church had become too worldly. One of his critical terms for the church, he called it papal paganism. The Reformation began in 1517. Within a generation or two, much of Central Europe had become Protestant, followers of either Martin Luther or another Protestant sect. So Martin Luther, his followers were Lutheran, there were also Calvinists, but there was this Protestant Reformation, the first great blow to the primacy of the church. Now that's the larger story. But what we want to focus in here is what did this Protestant Reformation mean for Jews? Well, initially, it actually seemed like it was going to turn out pretty good. Luther's attitude towards Jews was that the reason Jews refused or resisted converting to Christianity prior to 1517 partly was the fault of Jews. Jews were being very stubborn, but it was also part of the responsibility lay with the church itself. In the year 1523, shortly after the Reformation began, he gave a sermon and he wrote an essay called "That Jesus Christ was Born a Jew." Listen to what he says. "Therefore, I will cite from Scripture the reasons that moved me to believe that Christ was a Jew born of a virgin, that I might perhaps also win some Jews to the Christian faith." He says, if we strip away all the nonsense of the church and return the church to its pristine Christian origins, Jews will all become Christians. And he goes on to say, "Our fools, the popes, bishops, sophists, monks, the crude asses' heads, have hitherto so treated the Jews that anyone who wished to be a good Christian would almost have had to become a Jew." He's basically saying to the church, how can you imagine? Why would you think Jews will become Christians when you're persecuting them all the time? You expel them, you dispute them, you burn them, you burn the Talmud, and you think Jews are going to embrace this religion? Are you crazy? I'm paraphrasing. He says, "If I had been a Jew and had seen such dolts and blockheads govern and teach the Christian faith, I would sooner have become a hog than a Christian. They have dealt with the Jews as if they were dogs rather than human beings. They have done little else than deride them and seize their property. When they baptize them, they show them nothing of Christian doctrine or life, but only subject them to popishness and monkery. When the Jews then see that Judaism has such strong support in Christians, and that Christianity has become a mere babble without reliance on Scripture, how could they possibly compose themselves and become right, good Christians? I have heard myself from pious, baptized Jews that if they had not in our day heard the gospel, they would have remained Jews under the cloak of Christianity for the rest of their lives." Verses there. "For they acknowledged that they had never yet heard anything about Christ from those who baptized in him." Luther thought, with his new brand of Christianity, Jews were just going to flock into his churches and become Christian. He reached out to them. And, as it turned out, that did not happen at all. What he didn't realize is that, from a Jewish point of view, Luther, the Pope, yes, bringing some changes, it's all Christianity. It's the same. You still got Jesus Christ, right? Very few Jews converted. In fact, they concocted a kind of Hebrew play on words on Luther's name. You have Luther, the Hebrew word lo tahor, the phrase, which sounds like Luther. This means impure. That's what they called it. Luther's expectation was disappointed. Now we know what happens when someone like that is disappointed. If you have high hopes, then you get a little bit angry. In 1543, Luther writes an essay called "On the Jews and Their Lies."